Welcome, everyone. We're just giving it a couple of minutes while people log in before we get started. As you're joining us, please feel free to use the chat function to enter your name and your affiliation if you have one, just so everyone can see who's in the room with us today. And we'll get started at 10 o'clock. Welcome. Happy to see people are starting to log in. Please use the chat to enter your name and let people know who's here. I want to welcome everyone to our seminar on the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 consultation in Hawaii. This is a virtual presentation. Obviously, here in the time of COVID and coronavirus restrictions, it hasn't been possible to meet in person. So we've been working with a lot of virtual programming and webinars, and we're just so happy that all of you have taken the time to join us today. This presentation is a co-production with several partners. I'm Kirsten Faulkner. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Hawaii Foundation, and this class is also being supported by our Education Program Manager, Andrea Nandoscar, with additional technical support by Michelle Kizik, our Development Assistant. Historic Hawaii Foundation is a statewide nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1974 to help people preserve historic places. We did this in this program in cooperation with the National Park Service. Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo is the Preservation Partnerships and History Program Manager for the region that includes Hawaii. She's joining us from California today. Many people know the National Park Service for its role in, of course, national parks, monuments, trails, and memorials, but they also have an entire section on historic preservation and working with local and statewide organizations as well. So we're very pleased to have a cooperative agreement with the National Park Service that allows us to provide these community-based trainings. Today we're also co-presenting this seminar with the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations, which is part of the Department of Interior. Stanton Enomoto is the Senior Program Director for that office, and he's joining us from Oahu. The Office of Native Hawaiian Relations was established by Congress in 2004 to help the Secretary of Interior fulfill the responsibilities for Native Hawaiians and the Hawaiian Homelands Trust. So we're very thankful to Stanton and his office for their participation in this seminar too. So besides the three presenting sponsors, we also have the cooperation of three additional organizations that are helping to supplement our presentation today. The first is the State Historic Preservation Division of the Department of Land and Natural Resources. So later in the presentation, we'll be joined by Susan Lebo, who is the Archaeology Branch Chief for SHPD, and Dr. Lebo will help us with answering questions. She's also joining us from Oahu. One of our case study discussions is focused on a transportation facility on the island of Kauai. So the Department of Transportation is supporting us by providing the Kauai Regional Engineer, Larry Dill, and he's joining us from Lihue on the island of Kauai. DOT oversees the state's transportation network with airports, harbors, and highways, and we're specifically going to be talking about a highway project. And then finally, we've invited one of the consulting parties that participated in that Section 106 case study that we'll be presenting later. Maka'ala Ka'amoana of Hui Ho'omalu Ika'aina will be joining us as we discuss that project, and she's joining us from Honolulu on Kauai. So I want to thank all of our co-sponsors, our presenters, our participants for making time and helping with this presentation. So this course is a training in two parts. We're going to be presenting an overview of the National Historic Preservation Act and specifically the process for consultation between federal agencies, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and local constituents. Those local consulting parties include Native Hawaiian organizations as well as others, and we'll talk more about that. But really the idea is to work together to resolve effects on historic properties that might occur from federal actions. The goal of this training is to provide skill development and information on the engagement between government, nonprofit, business, and community interests as they interact, consult, and work on projects and undertakings, specifically to identify properties of historic and cultural significance and consult to resolve those effects on those properties. So today our class will take about 90 minutes. We're going to provide an overview of the four-step process, and part 2 of this class is scheduled for November 13th, and that one will focus more deeply on consultation practices with a particular focus on consultation with Native Hawaiian organizations. So again, we're not going to get into a deep dive on that particular topic, although obviously it's going to be woven in throughout the four-step process. But we do encourage you to sign up for part 2 if that's of particular interest to you. So for our time today, we've divided it roughly into thirds. The first portion is a presentation about the process, and we've included examples from Hawaii throughout the presentation. The second section will take a local case study, and we'll explore how it went in real life, how these steps were applied to that particular project, and then we'll get some lessons learned from some of the participants. And then our final section will respond to your questions. So as we go through, please be using the chat box. You can ask a question at any time. Just type those in as they occur to you. And Andrea will be organizing those, trying to get them in some kind of order. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, I will convey those to our panelists, and we'll go through as many as we have time for. Also, during this presentation, we have a couple of what we're calling knowledge checks. This is basically interactive polling where you're going to see a question pop up on your screen. And you can use your mouse to select the best answer of the options. We'll give it a few moments and then share those results. These results are aggregated. They're not associated with the individual, so we're not going to know how you voted or how an individual responded. And it's really just to help us see if the information is clear and help us connect with the virtual audience since we can't see you. So with that, we're going to try it. So everyone get ready. Andrea is going to pop up the first question, which is, please indicate your personal level of experience with the National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 process. Are you A, a beginner with no significant experience, B, a novice with some experience, C, intermediate with several years, or D, an expert with a high level of experience? So please go ahead and choose your best answer. We'll give that a couple of moments. Then, Andrea, when you see most people have responded, you can go ahead and share the results. All right. So it looks like we have kind of a mix between beginner and novice. Looks like novice at the highest with 42 people and beginner at 38, so just a little closer. Intermediate with people who have several years of experience, there's about 24. And we have 4 people who are experts. So yay, experts. We're happy to have you join us as well. So that was easy. I'm glad that worked out. So with that, I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to move on. And we're going to start with an overview of the Section 106 process. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo, who will get us started. So Elaine, mahalo, take it away.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with the basic definition of the Section 106. And, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to take into account the effects on historic properties of projects or programs that they carry out, fund, permit, license, or approve If a federal or federally assisted project or undertaking has the potential to affect historic properties, the Section 106 process is initiated by the federal agency. The Section 106 process provides the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, the State Historic Preservation Officer, NHOs, applicants, interested parties, etc., to a chance to weigh in on these matters before a final decision on a project or a program is made. And because the process is really rooted in consultation between the federal agency and the consulting parties, it provides a very important opportunity for members of the public, including Native Hawaiian organizations and others, to influence federal decision-making regarding historic properties, including those of religious and cultural significance to Native Hawaiians. Next slide, please. Implementation of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is often referred to as a four-step process. These steps were established and described in the federal regulations that implement Section 106, referred to as 36 CFR 800. And the general title is Protection of Historic Properties. And it also provides a detailed direction for how federal agencies that propose actions that might affect historic properties should implement the Section 106 process. We're going to give a very general overview of the 4 steps and then go a little bit more into detail with each one of them. But because we're on a time constraint, we're going to stick to kind of the focus on a general kind of basics, not unusual situations. And this flow chart, which is available on the Historic Hawaii Foundation website, you can use that as a simple diagram to follow along if you have it available. So the first step of the Section 106 process is initiating the consultation. If a federal agency determines that they have a federal undertaking, then they identify the consulting parties that may participate in the Section 106 consultation. They include the State Historic Preservation Officer and may include Native Hawaiian organizations, local government, and applicants for financial assistance if there is one. And the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has the opportunity to participate. And it also can include historic preservation organizations and others with an interest in the preservation outcomes of the project. After the agency initiates consultation, they've identified that they have an undertaking, they've identified consulting parties, then they identify and document the historic properties. So the agency has to, identify the historic properties that could be affected by the proposed undertaking. During this process, the agency continues consultation with the State Historic Preservation Division, NHOs, and other consulting parties. Next slide, please. After those first steps, the first 2 steps, the federal agency then determines how historic properties might be impacted or affected by the project and whether any of those effects could be considered adverse. The agency does this in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, Division, Native Hawaiian organizations, and other participants during this process. One thing to note is that there are time limits associated with this step. And so it's really critical that if you want to provide comment, that you do it within that period, that defined period of response, so that the comments can be considered. And in this, this step, the outcome will either be a determination of no adverse effect or one of adverse effect. If it has been found that there will be adverse effects, then we get to step 4, which is resolving the adverse effects. And the resolution of those adverse effects will be memorialized in a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic of agreement, which basically records the measures and stipulations that are agreed to by this federal agency and the consulting parties. One thing to note about the resolution of adverse effects stage is that it really doesn't, the regulations do not impose a time frame for this part of the process. Next, please. So this is our first knowledge check. Federal agencies are not required to consult with others on projects that might affect historic properties. True or false? Are we ready for the results? The answer is false, which almost everybody got. That's great. Federal agencies are required by the regulations to consult with the appropriate state and local officials, NHOs, applicants for federal assistance, and the rest of the consulting parties. One more knowledge check on this section. Section 106 applies when a federal agency, A, determines there is no undertaking, a federal agency funds, licenses, or approves a project that may affect historic properties, or C, an NHO determines there is a project. Are we ready for the, great. The answer is B, which just about everyone got right. A federal agency, Section 106 applies when the federal agency has funds, licenses, or approves a project that may affect historic properties. So now we're going to look at the first step of those 4 steps that we went through very quickly. The first step is for the agency to determine if there's a federal undertaking and whether it has the potential to affect historic properties. Okay. When a federal agencies consider actions, they're required under Section 106 regulations to determine if that action would be considered an undertaking. And there's a very specific definition for undertaking. An undertaking is defined as a project or program funded in whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of a federal agency, including those carried out by or on behalf of the agencies, those carried out with federal financial assistance, and those requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. If a federal agency determines that its proposed action is an undertaking, then it's required to determine if that proposed action is the type of activity that has the potential to cause effects to historic properties. If so, if that is the case, the federal agency is required to initiate consultation with the State Historic Preservation Division, identify the consulting parties, and invite them to participate in the consultation with them. They're also required to develop a plan for consulting with the public. However, if the federal agency determines the undertaking does not have the potential to affect historic properties, assuming they're present, the federal agency has no further obligations under Section 106. For undertakings with the potential to affect historic properties, federal agencies are required to define and delineate and document the area of potential effect in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer. So you can think of the AP, we call it an APE for area of potential effect. It's basically a geographic area within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause alterations to the character or use of properties if any such properties exist. The APE doesn't have to be one contiguous area, but it should be an area large enough where all direct and reasonably foreseeable indirect effects to historic properties could occur. The effects could be further removed in time, could be further removed in distance, and we would also consider cumulative effects. In this example on the slide, that red box is the archaeological study area where there might be archaeological effects and actually where the project occurred, and it's a multi-story high-rise. And so that larger boundary, that white dotted line, is the larger area of potential effect because of the potential for visual impacts on that area. Next slide. So our next knowledge check. A blank is required to determine if its action is an undertaking that might affect historic properties. Is the answer A, a federal agency, applicant for federal assistance, B, C, Native Hawaiian Organization, or D, contract archaeologist or historian? Do we have enough answers at this point? Maybe we can show the results. Great. The answer is A. A federal agency is required to determine if its action is an undertaking that might affect historic. Our next knowledge check. A blank is the area or areas within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties. Is it A, project area, B, historic district, C, traditional cultural property, or D, area of potential effect? Great. The answer is the area of potential effect. So after the next step, after the historic resources are, after the APE is established, is that the agency has to identify, determine if there are historic properties present within the area of potential effect. This allows, NHOs the opportunity to describe where their important cultural areas and places are located. Federal agencies are required to identify historic properties, including those of religious and cultural importance to Native Hawaiian organizations within the APE. Federal agencies are required to make a reasonable and good faith effort in identifying these properties and in consultation with the NHO and SHPO, as well as other consulting parties. The resources could already be listed on a national register. They could have already been determined eligible, but also they may not have yet been evaluated. Next, please. The regulations require the federal agency to apply the National Register eligibility criteria in consultation with the SHPO and any NHO that attaches traditional, religious, and cultural significance to the property. The federal agency may use their in-house expertise, they may hire consultants, but in the end, the agency determines whether they believe that the property is eligible for the National Register. They forward that decision to the SHPO for concurrence. Most eligibility determinations made in the Section 106 process are called consensus determinations because it only needs the consensus of the State Historic Preservation Officer, and it doesn't require nominating the property to the National Register. Consensus determinations that properties are not eligible should also be documented so that the consulting parties and the public have an adequate basis for understanding how the properties were, what properties were evaluated and how they were evaluated. The Determination of eligibility is based on the National Register criteria for listing properties on the National Register. And the critical point here is that the identification of historic properties in this process is that Section 106 only applies to properties that are listed on the National Register or those that are eligible for inclusion on the National Register. The eligibility requirements are established through the federal regulations, 36 CFR 60, and administered by the National Park Service. The National Historic Preservation Act expanded what was recognized as historic properties to include properties that are of local state significance in American history under architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture, and worthy of preservation. And the National Register is this list of recognized properties, and it's maintained and expanded by the National Park Service. There are 4 factors when considering whether a property is historic, or eligible for listing on the National Register. Is it a property? In other words, it's a site, building, structure, object, or district. Does it meet one or more of the significance criteria? Does it retain integrity? And it's there isn't an age limit, but if a property is less than 50 years, you do need to demonstrate exceptional significance. So you do need to look at the age of the property. So historic properties can be included of different types, as I stated, state sites, buildings, structures, objects, and districts. And they don't include just those, just the building. It includes the setting, the landscape, and small scale features associated with that property. And there are 4 significance criteria that we use, that we refer to by letters. Criterion A are properties that are associated with historical events and patterns. B, properties associated with important people. Criterion C are properties that are significant for their architecture, engineering, or construction. And then criterion D is properties that have the information potential, scientific information potential, often are archaeological resources. And then the next factor is whether the property has integrity. There are 7 aspects of integrity: setting, materials, location, workmanship, design, feeling, and association. And a property does not need to retain all 7 aspects of integrity. However, the integrity must be high enough so that the property can convey its significance. So, in consultation with the SHPO, federal agencies and NHOs, federal agencies are required to evaluate the significance of historic properties, including those of religious and cultural significance to NHOs, in accordance with the National Register criteria that we just went through. The passage of time sometimes will require an agency to go back and reevaluate properties previously determined eligible or ineligible due to changing perceptions of significance or incomplete prior evaluations. If the federal agency determines any of the National Register criteria are met and the SHPO concurs, then the property shall be considered eligible for the register for the Section 106 purposes. The concurrence of NHOs is not required. However, ACHP does encourage federal agencies to seek concurrence. If the federal agency determines that the criteria are not met, and the SHPO concurs, then the property is considered not eligible. However, we should note that there may be other federal or state regulations that may pertain to these properties. If it's on federal land, perhaps NAGPRA might apply, or the Hawaii Revised Statute 6E may apply. If there are situations where the federal agency and the SHPO do not agree, or if the ACHP requests, the federal agency is required to obtain a determination of eligibility from the Secretary of the Interior or through the keeper of the National Register. Or if an NHO that attaches religious and cultural significance to a property does not agree, that organization may ask ACHP to request the agency to obtain a determination of eligibility from the keeper. So to the last question on my watch, a federal agency proposes an undertaking that affects a property that was evaluated as not eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places 30 years ago. The agency may rely on the previous determination and does not need to reevaluate historic significance and eligibility. True or false? Great. False. The federal agency would be required to go back and do more evaluation due to the passage of time. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Stanton Inamoto.
Aloha, mahalo, Elaine. Aloha mai kako to those on the call. So yeah, I'll be walking us through in the next few minutes the second two steps. So we've gone through, this four-step process of identifying the undertaking, looking at the undertaking, and assessing whether there's historic properties or properties that are eligible for inclusion on the National Register that may be within the area of potential effect. And so now we're stepping into the third step in the process of assessing those adverse effects. So next slide. So the National Historic Preservation Act and the federal regulations that implemented 36 CFR Part 800, it requires federal agencies to engage in that consultation process with the SHPO and NHOs to determine, okay, we saw that there's historic properties or properties that are eligible. What's the effect of this undertaking in this undertaking, in this action? So the National Historic Preservation Act lays out 7 steps of what kind of adverse effects and what that process will look like. It could be things such as alteration that indirectly or directly affects the characteristics of that historic property in any way that diminishes the integrity of that property, the things that Elaine touched on earlier of design, setting, materials, etc. So next slide. Federal agencies are required, again, to consider all qualifying characteristics of that historic property, including those that may not have been listed yet or registered yet. They have to anticipate things, the effect of their undertaking on that historic property into the future. So even though there may not be documented effects, they need to consider the future effects of their activities. So next slide, please. So looking into sort of those 7 effects that are listed, they're all kind of intuitive. Some may be more nuanced, but obviously one adverse effect is the physical destruction or damage to the historic property. So it doesn't have to be complete demolition or destruction. It could be a portion of that site. In 1999, the regulations were updated to include archaeological data recovery as a potential adverse effect. So that's something for folks out there that do archaeological work to consider. Next slide. The second adverse effect pertains to alteration of the property. So this is kind of a broad category. It could include anything from restoration, rehab, maintenance, some kind of stabilization, or even if they're hazardous material, asbestos, whatever. Those things could be an adverse effect to the property, or even ADA requirements, modification to meet ADA could also be interpreted as an adverse effect. All things considered, though, they need to be, things that are not consistent with the Secretary standards would be, interpreted as an adverse effect. So, next slide. Another adverse effect is the removal of a property. This may not apply to archaeological sites, but historic structures. If, for example, the undertaking and the area of potential effect involves needing to remove a property from a specific place, that would be an adverse effect that would need to be mitigated. In some instances, though, I should say removal may be a preferred alternative to actual demolition or damage. So the fourth adverse effect involves the kind of a little bit more nuanced change of character, physical appearance, things that get into those aspects of integrity that Elaine talked about, whether it's setting or feeling or association. If the undertaking, kind of involves that, then that could be construed as an adverse effect. Next slide. Another area that perhaps might be a little bit nuanced gets into this area of visual or atmospheric or audible elements that affect the integrity of the historic property, could also be interpreted as an adverse effect. And by atmospheric, we mean kind of, the regulations talk about things like dust or smog or smells. So things visual, sensory, could be an impact. The example here we have is at Kalaupapa, where the Marine Corps proposed to do some training, and noise in this instance was an issue under the 106 consultation. So next slide. The sixth adverse effect that we could see in some undertakings is through the result of neglect. So if an undertaking proceeds, the project commences, and as a result of that project being implemented, there's this neglect that occurs through various activities. That could be an adverse effect as well. So it's not just what happens during construction, but through implementation of a project and execution. If it results in neglect that causes deterioration, that's something that can be interpreted as an adverse effect. There are circumstances in which if neglect or deterioration contributes to the historical significance of a property, then that can be considered as well. Next slide. And the last, or the seventh area of adverse effect deals with if an undertaking proposes to transfer or lease or sell a historic property kind of out of federal control to make way for the undertaking, that action is an adverse effect as well. So it doesn't apply, the adverse effects not only pertain to the physical aspects, but also the underlying land ownership and kind of the transactional nature of a particular property. So the federal regulations lay out these 7 steps or 7 adverse effects. I refer you back to that for more details. And here we are at a knowledge check. So true or false, federal agencies are required to consider all qualifying characteristics of a historic property when determining effects. True or false? Okay, where are we at? True. All right, everybody got it. Let's move on. We have another knowledge check. Let's see. Oh, okay. Here we are. Okay, so when we determine that there's adverse effects, how do we resolve them? It involves basically the execution of a document. And next slide, we'll get into that. And I want to try and keep on time here. But yeah, the regulations require that, again, federal agencies work to consult and determine the adverse effects on historic properties. They go through a process of notifying the advisory council of those adverse effects. They invite the advisory council to participate if they want. It's discretionary. And they also give the general public the opportunity to review and participate in that process. Next slide. So the key aspect, we've touched on it, Elaine touched on it, I touched on it, is this notion of consultation. It is this process of engagement between the federal agency and the consulting party, whether it's a Native Hawaiian organization or a historic preservation organization, et cetera. It's that act of engagement and consultation. What consultation does not do is that it does not cede control or decision-making authority over the undertaking to that consulting party. So it's, again, it's a process that's initiated by that federal agency to reach out and understand the issues, the adverse effects, et cetera, and try to seek resolution where possible. But it does not cede control. I think maybe in our case study, folks may want to talk about that further, but I'll touch on it here now. And in our November webinar, we'll get into this a little bit further. So next slide. The requirements for the federal agencies, if they determine that there is this adverse effect, and as they're engaging in the process of consultation, how do they go about addressing that? So the regulations talk about kind of 3 steps. They are somewhat hierarchical in the sense that if the undertaking can avoid those adverse effects, some way be modified or through some alternative can avoid it, great. If avoidance is not possible, how do they minimize those adverse effects to that historic property? And then thirdly, in the event they can't minimize and there is really this adverse effect, how do they actually mitigate that adverse effect? So I'll get into that in the next couple of slides here. So again, avoidance is pretty much self-intuitive. You move the project or move the undertaking in such a way that it avoids that impact. With respect to minimization, things can be a little bit more nuanced. It can involve a redesign of buildings, change of site plans, or realignment of things, again, to minimize those effects to the property. Next slide. And thirdly, again, where all of avoidance and minimization don't work, you get into this sense of mitigation. So there is an impact. What can be done to mitigate or offset those adverse impacts? And things can be done through, as the photo shows, through mitigation, or can be done through story maps or other kinds of activities. I think it's also important to note that mitigation does not have to be specifically at the site or within the area of potential effect. It can be broader than that. Again, it all depends on what gets addressed through consultation and memorialized in an agreement. And that gets me to the fourth step. So next slide. So how do those adverse effects get resolved and again, memorialized? And they're done through agreement documents. Try not to get too caught up in whether it's a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement. It really depends on the nature of the undertaking. But the fact is there needs to be a document that closes or resolves this Section 106 process. And that document, once it's executed, does become a legally binding document. So bear that in mind. Next slide. So those that are involved in the consultation, invited to be signatories, kind of the mandatory signatories are kind of laid out in the regulation. The signatories to whether it's a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement are the agency, obviously, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and the Advisory Council if they choose to participate. It's discretionary. The agency may invite others to participate and be concurring parties to the document, and that could include Native Hawaiian organizations or other agencies or organizations. So again, it's kind of that standard process applies both to MOAs as well as PAs. Next slide. So here we are at our knowledge check. Federal agencies must consider alternatives to the proposed action that would avoid or reduce the effect on historic properties. True or false? Give that a second. All right, everyone got it. Pretty much everyone got it right. Awesome. Okay, next, I think we might have another knowledge check. Yes, we do. Okay, federal agencies, MOA or PA memorializes the consultation and completes the 106 review. The agreement document is legally binding as part of the undertaking. True or false? Give that a few seconds. Awesome. All right. Good job, everyone. And at this point, I will pass the mic back to, I think, Kirsten to lead us into our case study.
Thank you, Stanton. Thank you, Elaine. When we started to put together this presentation, we realized that the kind of what you see on paper is hard to understand unless you see it applied to an actual example. So we tried to have examples of the different steps throughout the talking points, but I also wanted to walk us through a particular example, and this is the one from the Kauai emergency road repairs. So what we're going to do is talk about this project, see how the different steps applied, and then we're going to hear from both the project sponsor and one of the consulting parties so they can talk about how it really worked on the ground. So to set the stage here, in spring of 2018, there was epic rainfall on Kauai's North Shore. Basically put the town of Honolulu underwater. And this storm event lasted for 3 days in April. The island of Kauai was really devastated by severe flooding and landslides. In the Waipaw area, almost 50 inches of rain fell in a 24-hour period, which set the national record for rainfall in a single day. But more than the water, the landslides affected many, many areas. They blocked roads, the floods and the landslides tore apart homes, they uprooted trees. The calculation afterwards said that about 530 houses were either damaged or destroyed, and there was about $125 million in damages. And this really impacted especially parts of Kuhio Highway, and that's the belt road that goes onto the North Shore. It was so severe that local and national emergency crews were rescuing people from their flooded homes by helicopter, boat, and bus. And then just a couple of months afterwards, in August, we had Hurricane Lane, and that dropped even more rainfall in the same area, which magnified and exacerbated the damage. So when we apply these 4 steps in the Section 106 process, the first question is whether or not a federal agency is involved. If this is simply a county issue or a state issue, then that is reviewed under an entirely different process. But if there's a federal agency involved, then Section 106 kicks in. So in this case, the cost of reconstructing the highway was estimated about $100 million. And the Federal Highway Administration was providing that funding to their local partner, the Hawaii Department of Transportation. And then, of course, the second part of an undertaking test is whether or not the work itself is of a type that could potentially affect historic properties. So in this case, the project scope included removing the debris, then stabilizing the slopes, trying to kind of scale it so it wouldn't happen again, pavement repairs, road reconstruction, repairs to the stream crossings, and very significantly work on some of the bridges that were along this part of the road. So since the answer to the question of is there a federal agency involved and could the work potentially affect historic properties, the answer to that question is yes. So there is a federal undertaking, and the Federal Highway Administration decided to initiate the 106 process. Part of this initiation includes identifying the consulting parties and developing a plan to include the public. You can imagine this was of great public interest. People couldn't get to their homes, and they were, kind of being ferried back and forth. But the federal FHWA, of course, identified the State Historic Preservation Division. SHPD has to be involved in Section 106 consultation. Really, those are the only two that have to be there, the federal agency and the Historic Preservation Officer. But then, in this case, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation also decided to participate. They always have the option, and in this case, they took the option. Of course, the applicant for federal assistance is the Hawaii Department of Transportation. So DOT was responsible for actually doing the project. So, of course, they were involved. And then we had numerous local organizations, the Hanalei Roads Committee, of course, my organization, Historic Hawaii Foundation, as well as other local community groups and Native Hawaiian organizations. This is a photo of one of our small group discussions actually in Maka'ala's office. She's going to talk to us a little bit later. So this is part of the Hanalei Watershed Hui as well as the Hui Ho'omalu Ika'aina office. So that takes us to step 2, which is what is the area of potential effect. This one had a complicated APE because it had these dispersed sites. So this is one of several maps where they were showing where the work would actually take place. It was along the entire roadway, and then they specifically called out the slide repair areas, the staging and mobilization areas for construction, as well as points that would provide access. So this is an overview map, but there were some detail maps and zoom-in maps that showed very specific areas as well. Within that area of potential effect, the next step is to identify the historic properties that are potentially affected, that are within that APE. The Kauai Belt Road is actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a district. So it includes the roadway as well as various contributing features. So there are bridges and fords and crossings and view sheds and pullouts, and really the entire area on the North Shore has this spine of the road that runs through it. So it's designated as a historic property. Within that, in addition to being part of that district, the Waioli, Waipa, and Waikoko bridges were evaluated as being individually eligible for listing. So those were called out as specific historic properties. There was an archaeology review and field work that checked to see if there were any archaeological sites. And there were some in the general vicinity, but none within the area of potential effect. But it was also known that there were Hawaiian burial sites in the vicinity. And of course, you don't know if those are going to be affected or not until the work starts to be done. So there was sort of a general awareness that it was potential, but not exactly sure where. step 3 is to say, how will this undertaking or this project affect those historic properties? So to assess the adverse effects. So in the landslide repair site, there's the scaling and stabilization and trying to rebuild the roads and lost areas. So that work would not affect the setting or the location, but it would definitely affect the design, the workmanship, the materials, the feeling, and association. So that, of course, is an adverse effect. More significant effects, though, were being proposed for those 3 bridges. This is a significant point of discussion and conflict. A major repair site was on the far side of these bridges, and the construction crews said that the bridges would not support the weight of the heavy equipment that would be needed to clear the debris and repair the road. So Federal Highways and Hawaii Department of Transportation proposed to demolish the 3 historic bridges, replace them with new structures that could carry the loads, as well as meet other contemporary standards for width and railing. So clearly, that's an adverse effect to design, workmanship, materials, feeling, and association, possibly also to setting and location, such as if the alignment shifted or if the bridges got wider or anything like that. So this was clearly part of the potential effect, which took us to step 4. And resolving the adverse effects is where most of the effort and the time and energy came. And we talked earlier about the need to identify alternatives and ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate. So a lot of discussion was around alternative ways to get that construction equipment to the site that wouldn't involve demolishing those bridges. So looking at alternative access for construction, things like putting up temporary bridges or using water landings. This was an example that the Honolulu Roads Committee provided, saying, you could bring this barge right up onto the beach and take the equipment in that way. Potentially bringing in helicopters, potentially just deconstructing the crane and taking it across the bridges in pieces. Possibly modifying the needs for the clearance so you wouldn't need the heavy equipment. So those were some of the alternatives that were looked at. And then we also looked at alternatives for the bridges themselves. So say you were going to bring that heavy equipment across the bridge, is there a way that you could do that without destroying the bridge? So ways to either strengthen or reinforce the existing bridges or potentially modifying them, but keeping some of the key character defining features. So in this case with Waiole, the original railings, parapet walls were really important, but DOT was saying, hey, let's do this wider bridge that would be taller, wider, bigger. There were alternatives to look at replacing the bridges, but with new design, and then alternatives to look at replacing the bridges, but basically matching what was there historically. So those were some of the alternatives that were considered and discussed throughout this consultation process. In the end, a memorandum of agreement was executed by October of 2018. So because this was an emergency situation, everyone was quite motivated and worked very quickly. So between the flooding in April, the Hurricane Lane in August, and then the final agreement document was executed in October. And it includes several stipulations, specifically related to the bridge work. There was a decision to save Waiole Bridge. And this involved fall repair, structural reinforcement. They did this kind of fiberglass wrap to really support the structure of the bridge, as well as maintaining the dimensions, because this is a one-lane bridge that was really important, as well as this parapet walls. The Waipa and Waikoko bridges were changed. Some pieces were saved, some were not, but the design standards and final design were outlined through this MOA that looked at the width, the alignment, the railings, the girders, and the materials. And the MOA wrote in a design review process basically to make sure that there was compliance with these designs. There wouldn't be some kind of bait and switch. There was documentation of the bridges before they were lost. And the community asked for and received in the stipulation the right to have a gathering with cultural protocols and a public commemoration of these historic resources. They called it a funeral for the bridges, essentially. But it was a way to commemorate that history that would be lost. There was an adverse effect to the entire roadway, the entire district. So there were also stipulations that were related to that cumulative effect, things like updating the National Register form, developing an overall programmatic approach for all of the historic bridges on Kauai, maintaining and doing proactive repair work at Honolulu Bridge, which is the first bridge as you enter into this historic district. And so, you know, you're taking down some bridges, but you're going to repair and preserve another one. And then also ways just to make the road work better, some traffic control and parking restrictions to help preserve that rural character. And then finally, the MOA included stipulations to address the archaeological and cultural resources. Primarily, this was monitoring during construction and to ensure that if anything was found or disturbed, whether that was human remains or archaeological or cultural resources, there was a protocol in place that would stop work, provide for notification and consultation in case something was discovered. So following the execution of this MOA, the work got underway, and the road actually reopened on June 17th in 2019, so just about 14 months later. So that's an overview of what happened. I'm now going to invite Larry Dill, who's our Kauai Regional Engineer for the Hawaii Department of Transportation, and following him, Maka'ala Ka'aumoana from Huliho'omalu Ika'aina. And they're going to discuss the process, the outcomes, the lessons learned, and any advice for others who would be doing something similar. So Larry, go ahead and come on.
All right, thank you, Kirsten. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And actually, I'm going to show one of the graphics that Kirsten had on the screen. Are you able to see that graphic?
No, I don't see it. Larry, you want me to go back to one of the previous slides?
If you would please, it's the overall graphic that shows.
No, there it is. You got it.
It's up now?
You got it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Are you able to see my mouse moving around?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody, for having me here today, and good morning. It's still morning in Hawaii. This project, thanks, Kirsten, covered a lot of the issues actually I was going to touch on, so I'll focus just on a few things here. As she mentioned, Kuiu Highway, Route 560, is a 10-mile stretch. It's the end of the highway. So over to the left, the western end where you see the number 1, that is actually the end of the highway over there. And the other direction takes you back towards civilization. The majority of the damage that happened were the landslides. And those are all the purple dots that occurred between roughly mile marker 4.5 and mile marker 6.5. So 2 miles of highway was basically buried in thousands of cubic yards of debris. Our initial response was to work with the governor's office. The governor issued an emergency proclamation. That's part of what's necessary for us to access emergency relief funding from the Federal Highway Administration. And so when that Federal Highway Administration funding comes in, of course, that triggers the Section 106 process. The initial kind of steps we did was removal of all the emergency debris. And so that happened almost immediately. As that began to occur, it became apparent to us as we started developing plans for repairing, because we had major slope stabilization to occur, as well as we found certain locations where the roadway had failed and would have to be reconstructed, that there would have to be a lot of materials brought in and equipment in order to accommodate that work. Kirsten showed a slide. It showed the barge that was landing on Lumahai Beach. That barge is based out of the west side of Kauai and makes its trip from there around the northwestern quadrant of our island to get to Lumahai Beach. I did have conversations with that gentleman, and he was actually very discouraging, the operator of that barge, as far as being able to support our project and all the trips that would have to come in and out of there to supply materials and equipment, mainly the materials. In speaking to our contractor, one of our contractors that was working on the project, I asked them about trips in and out of there that would exceed the loading of the 3 bridges that was touched on, the Waioli, Waikoko, and Waipa bridges. Those are the the green dots on your map. And I said, well, there are dozens, hundreds of trips. And he says more like thousands of trips. And most of those trips were made by hauling of materials out, all the debris on the road that would cross the bridge, as well as hauling materials in that were necessary for reconstruction. Those were trucks that had a 7-ton tear weight, an empty weight, but loaded. They carried about 7 tons of material. So their 14-ton weight made, probably according to the contractor, thousands of trips across those bridges, which are posted at 8 tons. They have an 8-ton capacity. Those bridges, by the way, were constructed in 1912, obviously historic. And so we were concerned about how we would deal with that issue. Actually, I think about 6 months prior to the storm event in 2018, we had already made an agreement with the Central Federal Lands Division of the Federal Highway Administration to have them manage for us addressing those bridges because we were concerned about their structural integrity. So those were already on our radar as bridges that needed to be addressed, either repaired, rehabilitated, or possibly replaced, depending on the outcome of that process. However, because it suddenly became a sudden need for us to do that, we included those bridges in this project, and they were probably the focus of the Section 106 consultations that occurred. Through a lot of contentious community meetings, we ended up with the proposal, and I think as Kirsten initially mentioned, our initial plan was to replace all 3 bridges. But through further investigation, and I tip my hat to Maka'ala and others on this, it became apparent that the first bridge at number 13 on your map there, the Waioli Bridge, was not in as bad shape as the others, and it could undergo a rehabilitation, whereas the others would need to be replaced. Interestingly, the bridge at that green dot number 10, Waikoko Bridge, had actually been taken out or significantly damaged by a tsunami, I think in the 50s. And that was affectionately known on Kauai as the broken bridge because it was just filled back in without actually repairing it many, many years ago. So long story short, the outcome of the Section 106 consultation was that we were going to replace 2 of the bridges and rehab 1 of them. Now, part of the issue that we had with the process through here was the communication with the community. For reasons good and bad, DOT has had varying level of success with effective communications with the public. And I can tell you that very early on, when the issue first came up that we were going to have to address the bridges, my consultant said to me, if we replace these bridges, do you want them to be 1-lane or 2-lane bridges? Now, the engineer in me thinks 2-lane is a much better perspective from a traffic capacity. But very shortly and in the same conversation, we discussed, I think what was brought up by Kirsten, the fact that we have a Kuhio Highway Historic Roadway Corridor Plan, which was done in 2005, that came about after this whole highway area was listed on the national and state historic registers. In that guideline, when it speaks to the bridges, it says the default for any bridge that gets replaced is that the replacement bridge will also be 1-lane. Now at DOT, our priorities are 2, safety and system preservation. So in working with our consultants, I asked them, are there any safety issues with putting in 1-lane bridges here? And operationally, how does it look? And if there are issues, can they be mitigated? This is all from an engineering perspective. So they did their homework, got back to me and said, no, these things can adequately function and we can mitigate any safety concerns. And so right off the bat, our proposal was to replace those bridges with 1-lane bridges. The next question that comes into play from an engineering perspective is if the bridges are 100 years old, there are certain things that do not meet today's engineering standards, including the width of those bridges, providing adequate shy and buffer zones from traffic and the parapet walls there. So we stuck with 1-lane bridges with, I would say, slight modifications to those bridges. The Waioli Bridge is the exception because it got replaced basically close to exactly as its existing configuration. So that was dealt with in that manner. The other thing I guess I'll touch on is that obviously the challenging part of the 106 process from our perspective is resolving issues related to adverse effects on the bridges. We always shoot for a win-win in this regard, but it almost always involves some compromise. And hopefully, from my perspective, I would hope that the compromise is more or less equal on both sides of the fence when it comes to arriving at the solution for a project, so that we can both look back with pride upon what would happen. And I would say, I certainly look back on this overall issue with pride. I believe that we operated with integrity in managing the 106 process, but it was challenging in a lot of ways. One of the examples is, I think as was touched on, Native Hawaiian organizations are accorded special status in the 106 process. And so we did have a couple of meetings, not with the community at large, but with representatives of the Native Hawaiian organizations, the NHOs. The NHOs that came to the table are very passionate, but didn't always agree with one another on how we should respond to things. And it was, we did our best to manage that situation so that we could take care of many things as possible. But at the end of the day, we aren't able to always take care of everybody's concerns when we do a project. Also, other issues, not necessarily related to historic issues, would creep into the process. For instance, there were a lot of sovereignty concerns that were brought up by Native Hawaiian organizations, and who had actually jurisdiction and authority to be doing this work from that perspective. You know, from my perspective, you know, I'm the highway guy. I'm just trying to fix the highway, and really sovereignty issues are not something that can be addressed. But nevertheless, there is a lot of emotion and passion that gets involved in these discussions. So we always try to guide the discussion back to the issues at hand and resolve matters in that context. But it was very challenging. I'll say again, at the end of the day, I'm proud of the work that we did here. Work that DOT has to do that I learned from this issue is that we've got to work on our communications with the community. We've got to make sure that we are consistent on following up on the stipulations that occur from memoranda of agreement that get executed for projects like this. I can tell you with this project of the, I don't know how many stipulations, but most of them we've done, we've checked the box and they're complete. There are a couple that are ongoing. You know, we're still working on a programmatic agreement for historic bridges. That's going to be a long-term process, but that is in the works. The rehabilitation of Honolulu Bridge is upcoming. We've got almost gotten a design contract to do that work for us. So that's something that's still following up on. But generally speaking, we have to make sure that we do follow up on our commitments that are identified in those memoranda of agreement. I think that's all I have to share at this point, Kirsten. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. We really appreciate that. If you can stop sharing your screen, and then Maka'ala, if you'd like to come on. So of course, Larry just explained the perspective from the project proponent, and Maka'ala is going to share her perspectives from as one of the consulting parties who participated in this. So thank you.
Aloha, I'm Maka'ala Kaumawana, and I'm very thankful for this opportunity to share from the community's perspective. In this particular situation, as Larry said, there were several community interests that were involved, that knew things, that cared, and we tried to work together. The main issues there, as Larry also described, is many of the issues impacting our communities have nothing to do with the 106 process or the projects that are proposed. And so it's a situation where if somebody's listening to me and I have other issues, I'm going to take that opportunity to say all the other things that are going wrong. So it is a process to be managed. And we appreciated the help from all of the agencies in that effort. The federal folks really gave us a helping hand in managing that. One of the things I want to say from the beginning is for a 106 consultant to know, and all of you folks should be helping your people understand this. I, as a consultant, could request, and in this situation did request, individual meetings with our organization in order to reduce the distraction of the other issues and other organizations that weren't even talking about the work and project at hand. So that helped us focus on those issues that we cared about. The other thing I want to say is that in our situation, we do have many organizations and individuals in our community that worked on the designation for this highway and those bridges, and we're very close to the subject. These bridges matter to us. They're not just bridges, they're not just things. So the one bridge that we were able to rehabilitate and not replace, the Waioli Bridge, is that thing exactly. That is a control point for the communities to the west of that structure. It controls the pace and scale of traffic. It controls the scale of development. It controls your emotional and mindset as you proceed to that part of our island, which is very rural, with narrow roads and children and animals on the road, many places of great beauty that are easy distractions. So these bridges aren't just a way to get across a river. These bridges bridge time and people. And the Waioli Bridge particularly is an entrance to another world and to a personal life that we have past that bridge. And we never do this work alone, and we have worked with Historic Hawaii Foundation since we put this road on the register. And our purpose in doing that is the same purpose we had in being a 106 consultant, and that was to preserve the rural character of this place. That's a terminology that you all know, that we all know and use, but in my life, in my world, it means that when my grandchildren are walking back from fishing or back from the beach, that they can safely get into a vehicle and get home, that they're not right next to racing cars and a big wide road that encourages speed. So these things are personal to us, and the bridges are very personal to us. When a developer or in this case our government proposes to do work in a special circumstance, such as a declared disaster or emergency, time is not the community's friend. Having to get this done quickly, needing to restore access for health and safety, were all compelling forces speeding the calendar up. And that is not easy for community or 106 consultants to respond to, because talking with people and listening to people takes time. To do it right takes time. And it was a tension point throughout this process that, you know, we must hurry. And we kept saying, no, we must do it right. We must do it right. And those two things do not necessarily jibe. And we understood the pressure of the funding and the construction work and how long folks thought it was going to take. But what mattered more to us was the quality of the end result and the reduced impact or potential mitigation for our losses for the benefit of all Kauai. I want to emphasize that one of the components of the MOA is that all bridges on Kauai will be addressed in as much of a sensitive way as they can be. So we weren't just concerned about our backyard. We weren't just thinking about what was happening to us. We were trying to help other communities who would be going through this process and helping them learn from what we've been through, and also helping them have a smoother path than we had in the future. Speed is not the friend of community, and in this case, it was an aspect of this project that is foreign to us. That is not what Indigenous peoples, and certainly not Hawaiians, believe produces the best product. We don't believe in speed as a mode of efficiency. We believe in completeness, patience, taking the time that things take. And so we were conflicted from day one. And the good thing is that many of the engineers that were involved were people that we knew, that had worked with the State Highways Department for many years. They weren't new to us. They weren't foreign to us. They were people whose last names we were familiar with and could pronounce. And so there was a bit of a personal touch to this consultation, which I think in the end really helped. Many of them still call me auntie, and that's a sign of respect, and I appreciated it. And it also set a certain tone in the conversation. Not that I knew what an engineer was really talking about, but that I knew that I was being heard and listened to. Well-intentioned engineers and public servants respond to these situations with less patience and less time to listen. We were in this situation trying to acknowledge that their intentions were honorable and that the work they were proposing was a good thing, a good idea. But we were steadfast. Thanks, Larry, for the call out. I was not having it that Waiole Bridge would be replaced, not unless they could really prove it. And they began by saying, well, it's just all bus up underneath. Well, then we went down and looked, and it really wasn't so bus up. So you can't. Lesson learned for communities and for all of you who consult with local people and community organizations. Take that second look. Take the time to take that second look. You may find a way to work around it and be gentler on the structure. The historic bridges are vital to our way of life. It isn't just a thing. It isn't just a cultural or historic use. They meant so much more to us. So when we got the agreement to have the cultural gathering, that's what that was about. That was about us being able to gather and to mourn. And that's what I said at the event. We mourned the loss of Waipa and Waikoko bridges, and we were thankful for the restoration of the Waiole Bridge. And it gave us a chance to thank the engineers for listening, gave us a chance to acknowledge each other, and to stay committed, to stay involved. And we continue to grieve the loss of our bridges, but we're grateful that we saved one. We saved the beginning one. And certainly not everybody is pleased with the outcome, but we felt that it was fair. And we keep an eye on that work on the Hanalei Bridge. Larry knows that I'm on him on a regular basis. What is happening? And when I see the workers looking at it, I'm hopeful that that bridge will be maintained in a way that it should be. Mahalo.
Thank you, Maka'ala. I very much appreciate you providing that commentary. And really, I think the emphasis on relationship building and communication came through from both Maka'ala and Larry. I'd like to invite all of our panelists to come on. You can unmute and turn on your videos. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but we do want to take some and be able to address some of the issues that came up. And I do want to acknowledge that Susan Lebo from the State Historic Preservation Division, who did not speak earlier, but she is here to help answer questions as well. So we've heard a lot about time and timing, and early on in the Section 106 process, there are very specific time steps for responding, but then in the resolution of adverse effects, there aren't specific regulatory time set. And Makala kind of said, you know, it takes as long as it takes because you want to get it right, but at the same time, there's sometimes an urgency to seeing the process move forward. You don't want it to just linger forever. So the question we got was, how long does it typically take? What are some of the factors that go into some of that? And how can you keep a process moving, but at the same time take the time to do it correctly? So Susan, I'm going to get your perspectives first, and then if anyone else wants to weigh in on that. So Susan, can you talk about the time it takes to balance keeping a process moving while still doing it correctly and having meaningful good faith consultation?
So one of the things that we look at initially is first, what is the proposed project? But we also look at who we think should be involved in the consultation process and whether or not they've been identified by the agency that's proposing the project. So for us, the consultation component is very critical. We want to make sure that all of the appropriate parties have the opportunity to participate. And then also just that we also need to look at whether or not the process also involves the state historic preservation process. And so how to dovetail those two things together as we go through the process.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any perspectives on how to balance meaningful consultation with continuing to move forward? Go ahead, Elaine.
Hi, I just wanted to add this, maybe this is more for the agency side, that when the agency comes in early in consultation and consults early with possible parties, as well as when they identify the APE appropriately and identify the resources in a robust fashion, that often can keep things moving more quickly, opposed to when there isn't a full enough identification of historic resources or consulting with people to find out what properties might be there. That can really slow the process down. And so I think that from an agency side, doing what you can to make sure you're covering both the resources and engaging people early.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, doing your homework is going to save steps later. There's that saying of go slow to go fast, meaning that if you work slowly in the beginning to do all the research, to build the relationships, to have that meaningful input, then later on the actual projects go much quicker. Yeah. We had a question, and Stanton, this is going to go to you first, but we've talked a lot about the role of Native Hawaiian organizations and specifically the right to participate in this process. So the question is, how do you pick an NHO? You know, does the federal agency get to pick which ones they talk to? Do they get to cherry pick, or is there a specific standard list? Because there's not a government-to-government relationship like there are with Native Hawaiian tribes. How do the NHOs get notified? How do they get this entry? And does the federal agency get to decide who gets to play and who doesn't?
Thanks, Kirsten. That's a great question. A lot of questions within that. I guess for folks to know, the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations does maintain a list of Native Hawaiian organizations. So if people want to go to our website, and I think we have our contact information somewhere in these PowerPoint slides, let me know. If folks aren't on our list, they can get on our list, and that list is used by not only federal, but various state agencies in their process of consultation. So it's not exclusive. That's not the only way for Native Hawaiian organizations to participate in the process. Other ways, I think, and maybe we'll touch on this more in our workshop in November, but really is it's kind of incumbent on Native Hawaiian organizations to be aware of what's going on around the areas or the lands that they have interest in. So whether it's through paying attention to Office of Environmental Quality, notifications, state agency notifications, or OHA newsletters or others, people have to pay attention to what's going on. Another strategy is to make the government agencies aware or knowledgeable of who they are and what they do, what they represent. So it's, again, as Kirsten and others have touched on before, it's about building that relationship between community and government. And the more I think we're able to do that and strengthen those relationships, that improves notification and awareness of undertakings that may affect them.
Thank you, Stanton. I think that's a good point, that it's a two-way responsibility, that the federal agency needs to make a good faith effort to find and notify, but the organizations themselves also have opportunities and resources available to them.
Yep.
We have time for one more question, and this might be a question for Susan, maybe the agencies as well. But the question is, once these agreement documents are executed, the PA, the MOA, how can people know what they are and where to find them and what they say? Are they kept online somewhere? Is there a library? Is there, can you ask for them? Are they public documents? Where are they?
So the agency whose project or undertaking it is, so say if it's a federal highways project, they would be the office of record and they would maintain a copy of that in their records for that project. And all the other parties who signed on to that agreement document, so in this case, the State Historic Preservation Officer, we also would maintain a copy of that in our office. And so that is something that the public could make a request to see. So each of the agencies,
proactively,
we don't post them
list
on our
somewhere.
website, or no, we don't proactively post them on our website.
Larry, does the Department of Transportation make those available, or is it by request only?
Like Susan said, for her division, we do not maintain a public access website with that information on it, but it's certainly available to anybody that makes the request of us.
So basically, if somebody has some reason to believe there was an MOA or PA executed, then they would contact the agency and ask for a copy of it, or the State Historic Preservation Division.
Yep, that is correct.
And then if the ACHP participated, they also would maintain a copy.
Okay. I know we could probably talk about this forever and ever, but we're really coming to the end of our time. So before we leave, I did want to just share a couple more things. So Stanton had mentioned that you can get in touch with any of his office, and of course the Historic Hawaii Foundation and Elaine's office as well. So I've popped up our contact information on the screen so you can see that. And all of the other speakers, especially the State Historic Preservation Division, also have a website with all of their contact information on it. So you can take a look at that. We're going to be posting the recording of today's event, so you can also refer back to these slides as well. I wanted to mention ways to learn more. So we are going to have a part 2 of this seminar, which will really do more discussion around the consultation process and the role of Native Hawaiian organizations. It's kind of embedded throughout, but we wanted to spend a little more time on it. So part 2 of this seminar is going to be held in November, and you can sign up at historichawaii.org. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation also has a really robust and great library with online trainings. These are on-demand, online webinars. They're not webinars, so they're not live. You can sign up for which ones you want. So there's one on the basics. There's one on integrating Section 106 with environmental reviews. There's one specifically on consultation with Native Hawaiian Organizations that Stanton and I both worked on with ACHP. So there's lots of different online resources that are available as well. So I wanted to make sure people knew about other resources. So with that, I just want to say mahalo to all of our speakers, all of our attendees, and just thank you all for being part of this.
Mahalo.
Okay. We'll see you next time.